Hey everyone, welcome to this video where I'm going to talk about floating. Specifically, I want to talk about what floating is, how to clear a float, how to contain a float, and why we use floats. So far, everything that we've done has followed what we call the normal flow in our CSS layout model. And that just means that elements are going to appear in our browser in the same order in which they're written into our source code. So block level elements will stack on top of each other and fill the width of the browser window or their containing element, whereas inline elements will line up next to one another and fill the content they contain. And just note, even though images look like they might be block level elements because they do have a width and a height, they're actually considered an inline element. So take a look at what I have up on my screen. This is a floats playground that does a really good job of demonstrating what it looks like when we're floating. There's 5 total elements on our screen, and if we were to preview our HTML, we would see that item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are listed in the HTML in that order, so that just means that they're stacking one on top of another. This is considered the normal flow. When we change or modify our normal flow by floating, what we're basically doing is we're picking up that item out of the normal flow. So just for an example, I'm going to show float left on this first block, and then I'm going to toggle the perspective. So what you're seeing is that it looks like it's lifted right up out of the flow. It's not on the same plane of existence. But that second block has shimmied right underneath it, trying to get as close to the top as it can. If I were to select this second block and then float it to the right, and I toggle this perspective, it causes the third and fourth and fifth blocks to shimmy up as tight as it can to the top, and it looks like that third element has disappeared completely, but it's not gone. It's just underneath our first element. Let me toggle that again. It's still there, just like our fourth one is still there. It's just that they don't exist on the same plane visually. This is a really cool tool to play around with, and I highly recommend coming out here. Try some different combinations and see what happens. And just sort of observe what happens when you're floating left and right, when you're not floating anything, or if you're clearing any of those properties. But let's dig into that a little bit more inside of VS Code. Now I'm going to use the week 11 demo that's out in Blackboard for positioning, and I have it opened up in my VS Code, and I'm going to open up all of my files. We'll take a couple of seconds to look at what we've got. Our document has a header, a main, and a footer, and our main has 2 paragraphs and an image. We also have a background color on our header and our footer so that we can visually see this a little bit easier. Plus we put a border around our main element. Let's take a look at the CSS. Notice how our image is really large at this point. We're going to adjust that using a CSS property for the width. So I'm just going to say that the image is going to have a 40% width. Now remember, this image is sitting inside of the main element, so it's only 40% of the main element. So when I resize my window, notice that because we're using a percentage, it's allowing that image to scale with our browser. The image is always going to remain 40% of its container, and we have a lot of wasted space that's on the right-hand side of that image. Let's use the float property so that we can make text wrap around the image, and that's really all floating is. It's floating an element to move it to the left or the right and allowing text to wrap around it. Now just like that, using the float property takes the element out of that normal flow. I wish I could toggle the perspective so that you could see the image would appear almost like it's higher up so that the text can kind of go underneath it. Now in this case, we force it to the left. If we were to change our CSS rule to float to the right-hand side, we would see it flopped. When we float an element, everything in the source code that's underneath that element is going to attempt to float around it. So if you notice, the footer and the main element, they're behind the main image. Let me demonstrate that by opening my viewport. As I continue to make this larger, notice that the image continues to grow to 40%, but it pops out below that footer. We can fix this. First, let's take a look at the text that's in our main element. It's really crowded around our image. We're going to add a margin, but we're only going to add it on the left side of our image. That does look a lot better. Now we don't want that footer to slide underneath, so we need to turn off the wrapping and get it back into the normal flow once we get down to the footer element. Essentially, what's happening is the image is loading and floating, and it's causing the paragraphs to wrap the text around. Once we get out of the main and down to the footer, we want it to stop at this point, so we're going to apply a rule to the footer to clear that property. Now notice when we clear, we have a couple of options. We can clear both left, none, right. We floated on the right-hand side. We want to clear on the right because the clear is clearing out whatever was being floated to that side. So if you float to the left, clear left. If you float to the right, clear right. And you can clear a float that's on both the left side and the right side if you want to use clear both. Make sure that you're only clearing what you need to clear. You don't want to clear both if you only have a float on one side. So I'm going to clear right. Now when I expand my viewport really wide, my footer will stay below my image. Notice how it pushes that footer down? That's because we have stopped wrapping and put the footer back into the normal flow. We do have an issue though, because our container element, our main, it's shorter than our image. Because by default, floats are designed to hang out of the element they're contained in. Since the floated element is outside of the normal flow, the container it sits in, the main in our example, is only as tall as the unfloated content. What that means is the two paragraphs is what's being used to define how large our main can get. If I added several more paragraphs to this main element, then our main would have more room. But we can expand our container to surround the image once again visually by applying a float to it as well. So let's add a float to the main element. I already have a main selector, so I'm just going to add to it. This allows the image and the main to exist almost as if they're on the same plane, and because we're clearing the footer will always stay below the main element. Anytime that we want to float an element, we're going to use three very key steps. First, we want to provide a width for our floated element. Second, we want to float that element to either the left side or the right side. And then third, we want to make sure we're including a margin so that anything that we're wrapping doesn't crowd up to that floated element. And that's really it for floats. But if you have any questions on this, please don't hesitate to ask.